I'd like to start with a quote that I found online that you created. I think it sets the tone and tells a lot about who you are. And the quote is, "The most powerful sound in the universe are words of love and encouragement." So with that in the background, tell us a little bit about yourself and how you came to be where you are today.
You know, Peter, thank you very much for inviting me to be your guest for this interview. Where do you start with telling your story? I think today if someone asks me, what do you do, I often will say, I'm a recovering tax attorney. And they say, recovering tax attorney, what do you mean by that? And I said, well, you know, I basically for 30 years practiced tax law, and I'm now recovering from that. But there's another meaning to it, which is I think I've gained through that journey insights into how important tax minimization, tax avoidance, tax efficiency in planning is. There is this whole other world that we have largely ignored. So my journey, I practiced in all sizes of law firms, boutiques to large, what today is a national law firm. I've been privileged to work with clients across the spectrum of wealth. So ordinary people to families that are uber wealthy. And I was, for many years, really a tax geek. I was absolutely convinced that everything began with and ended with the word tax. 2001, a client called me up. This was a client that had risen to a spectacular level of wealth from bankruptcy in a remarkably short period of time, over about 15 years. And in this process, early on, when he wasn't worth a lot, he had started what I call the Estee Lauder formula of wealth transition planning. Estee Lauder is famous for having, every time a new fragrance was conceived, she would, before that fragrance was a marketing success in its earliest inception, she would fractionalize the ownership of the formula and share it with all generations of her family. So this client had been doing something similar. Every time he started a new business venture, he would put 20% of that in a trust for one child, another child, and retained 40% for his wife and himself. And over time, not all, but several of these businesses had become quite valuable. And he was very concerned about the impact the wealth would have. And so he sent me a book, and he said, would you please read this book and let me know what you think? I think it has answers to the questions that I've been asking you about how I should go about getting my children ready for the wealth that I've already, in a sense, put aside for them, transferred to them. And so I sat down on a Saturday morning in a chair about as comfortable as this chair and almost didn't move for 6 hours except for bio breaks and fixing a sandwich for lunch. And in that 6 hours I read this little green paperback called Family Wealth, Keeping It in the Family. And as the week started, the first thing I did was call this gentleman and say, wow, this book is amazing. I have found in it more kind of secrets around what we need to be doing proactively to help families preserve their wealth and to have that wealth be a positive influence on the rising generations of the family. This is great. Thank you. And he said, well, I'm glad you feel that way. I want you to find this man and engage him as a consultant. I want him to kind of take my family on a journey educating my children around the principles that he has written about. And so this is pre-Google, pre-Facebook, pre-LinkedIn. Think about how social media and the World Wide Web and the internet has changed everything for us. But at that time, the way you found a lawyer, and that all I knew was the name of the gentleman, that he was a lawyer in New York City, and I had a self-published book. So no address, no clue as to where in New York City. So I went to the law librarians and gave them this task to find this man. 2 days later, they came back to me and said, we've looked high and low, and we could not locate this individual. The last record we found was in 1998. He was still admitted to practice law in the state of New York, but not in 1999, so he is either left or retired, but we couldn't find any listing. We called a previous law firm, a big law firm that he had practiced in 10 years earlier, and they had nobody could help us with an address. So we don't know. We just don't think, unless you want us to call every James Hughes in the New York City phone book, we don't know how we're going to find this man. So I shared that with the client, and the client said, oh, don't worry, I'm reading another book. I said, what is it? And he said, 7 Habits for, and I finished his sentence, highly effective individuals. He said, no, highly effective families. I said, Covey's written a book for families? I had no idea. He said, yes, in fact, I think in many respects this book is more practical, more grounded than the other book. I said, well, I happen to know Covey's estate planning attorney. I can call him. I'm sure I can get us in touch with Covey. I don't know whether he'll engage. He says, well, do it. Before I could place that call, that afternoon, I walked into another partner's office. This was completely out of mind. And we had a 15-20 minute conversation about a project we were both working on. I walked out of his office, went out the door, closed the door behind me, and took about 4 paces down the hallway. And it was like I walked into a solid wall of impression. And it just stopped me. And the impression was, turn around and ask him if he knows James E. Hughes Jr. And I thought, this is just crazy. What is he going to think of me? But I couldn't go forward. I went back. I knocked timidly on the door. Yes, and I said, Judd, I'm sorry to take more of your time, but by any chance, do you know a New York City lawyer by the name of James E. Hughes Jr.? He swiveled around in his chair so fast I was sure he was going to say, get the blippity-blip out of my office. Instead, when he comes around, he's holding a little green book. And he says, you mean J Hughes? I said, you know this man? He says, our firm represents his significant other. I said, you can put me in touch with him? He says, well, I'm not going to give you their residence in Aspen, but I will give you his private secretary's line in New York City. And so the next morning I'm on the phone, and that led to a conversation about a week later for 3 or 4 hours near the Denver airport with my clients and Mr. Hughes. And at the end of that, my client said, Mr. Hughes, we'd like to have you serve our family as a consultant and share these principles we've been talking about with our children. And that started a 5-year journey. Twice a year, J Hughes would show up for a day and a half of family meetings and family gathering, and we educated the next generation, the rising generation of that family. And I carried his briefcase for those 5 years, and in between those family meetings, we were in constant contact, and as I was traveling around the country, he'd say, go and talk to so-and-so. And so what happened in that 5-year period, Peter, was J Hughes kind of opened up his Rolodex of thought leaders and innovators and shared it with me. And in that 5-year, very formative period of time, I began to transition from being a lawyer who practiced tax law to being a counselor who began to understand that tax planning was just one of several important tasks that families need to engage in. It isn't the end-all be-all that for years I had thought it was. So that's kind of how I took this new trajectory in my professional path. At the end of that 5-year period, J Hughes said to me, "You're going to leave the large law firm and you're going to do what I do." And I said, "Jay, I'm going to do what you do, but I'll do it inside the large law firm." "My friend," he said, "you're sadly mistaken. You can't do this work in a large law firm." And for a year and a half, I sought to prove him wrong. And then we hit the economic blizzard of 08, 09. I had really convinced the management of the firm to embark on a new, what they would call, grand experiment. And then in October of 08, they came into my office one afternoon and said, "Sorry, we can no longer afford the grand experiment. You're going to have to go back to practicing the way you have traditionally practiced." And that's the night I came home and told my wife, Jay was right. I'm not going to be able to fulfill my dream of doing this work inside a large law firm. But the good news is, we can always look back at turning points in our professional or personal life and identify moments. That moment was one I felt extreme anger and betrayal because I had their commitment and it had been pulled away from me, and my dream was frustrated. The reality is I had no clue what the future held, but I needed to get out of the law firm. Jay was right. Not just to do the work he was doing, but more importantly, leaving the large law firm. As I thought about that for the next 6 or 9 months, thought about what I would do, what began to coalesce was I had been so privileged to learn so much from him and from the others across the country that he had introduced me to. I thought, what could be more important than sharing this thought leadership and these new paradigms that are so critical to the successful intergenerational transfer of wealth, as he defines wealth. And we can talk a little bit more about that if you care. But what could be more important than sharing this and helping others discover the new and better ways that I felt from what I had observed in these conversations? There was really a silent revolution taking place that most professional advisors and consultants were unaware of. And I had been privileged to peek into that world. And how valuable would it be if I could share access to that thought leadership with others? And that's when the idea for an institute came in mind. It was conceived to explore and share leadership. It was also to encourage, foster more frequent and effective collaboration, because I had seen through the journey of J Hughes, he was a masterful collaborator. He was absolutely vigilant for opportunities to bring other expertise and processes into the circle of working with the families that he was entrusted to help them with their missions. And I began to see how expertly he would choose collaborators and how he would introduce them and how successfully they could help families move forward. And so I became convinced collaboration was something that all the frontline advisors needed to become more savvy, aware of, and savvy at doing. So those were the two overarching reasons that I left the large law firm, was to create this institute that we called the Purposeful Planning Institute. I founded it in early 2010, so we've been about 6 years now in the journey.
So I'm thinking that I want to summarize what's different between the old way of doing estates, which is focusing just on taxes, which is really making it all about money. And if I'm not oversimplifying it, this new way making it more about people, about human beings. And I don't know if you want to spend just a minute or two on why this is so much more compelling and how it's what it is. We know what money is, kind of, and taxes, and that's okay, good. But this other side of it.
Well, there's several things I could say about that, and in spending some time in your office today and looking at your bookcase, I noticed a couple of books that have powerfully influenced me. One is called The Soul of Money by Lynn Twist. And in that book, she introduced me to the concept. So this is maybe 10, 12 years ago that I first read Soul of Money. And she introduced me to the concept that money has an energy, which can either be positive or negative. And initially I scoffed at that, but the more that I have thought and observed, I'm absolutely convinced that she's right. Money can either be given a positive or a negative energy. And I think that technical planning that's grounded and centered in tax minimization, in asset protection planning, it's very important from a legal and a financial investment standpoint that planning be done well, with excellence. So please don't ever think that I'm suggesting that you do this on your own, although there are things I think you can do on your own, and we should talk about what some of those would be that you don't have to have a team to help you with. But I do think that introducing, basically bringing a heart and a soul into the planning process is critically important if you want it to be a positive experience both for you, but more importantly for the rising generations that will be the beneficiaries of that planning. And so yes, I do feel very strongly, Peter, that there's been far too much emphasis on how to protect heirs from the money and from the legal predators. But you don't want to avoid that, but you want to make sure that as you do that planning, you introduce into the planning enough positivity that you're not going to leave your children and your grandchildren to ask this question: didn't they trust me? Sadly, I have been asked that, where somebody had created a very technical plan and it had lots of trust structures built into it, and the immediate and obvious question that an uninformed beneficiary will ask is, didn't they trust me? Did they think I was stupid? Did they think I was going to be influenced by people who would take this away from me? Were they trying to protect me? So there's just a lack of understanding around the whys behind this planning. And I think one of the biggest breakthroughs for me in the last 10 years is an exercise that we use that's called why a trust, why this trust, or why a plan, why this plan, that introduces clients to the non-tax, non-legal purposes for the planning. And it's amazing when you open up that possibility to clients, how important, if you said to a client, pick the 5 most important of all of these purposes that we've identified, both tax, legal, financial, investment-driven purposes. Pick the 5 most important. I've had many cases where the tax, the financial, legal reasons for the plan are not among the top 5 in importance. And so that has convinced me that when we give clients opportunities to think more deeply about the plan that they're creating, and that, by the way, is something I think is a plan done, made, baked, or is a plan created. A creative process is what purposeful planning is all about. It's allowing the trust creator or the plan creator to purposely think with deep reflection around what matters most, and then to make sure that all aspects of the plan, from drafting, design, implementation, are congruent with what matters most.